Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is the second in the series with Dr. Carrie Jones. She's the Chief Medical Officer for DUTCH Test. We'll be talking about the cortisol awakening response. Today we went a little bit deeper on resilience and specifically how you could use the cortisol awakening response with patients. And there was a really incredible moment where we were talking about autoimmune disease and the CAR that if you're working with patients in autoimmune, I highly suggest you stick around for really, really interesting half an hour. Enjoy. So a warm welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Carrie Jones. Welcome, Doc.
Thanks so much, James. This is going to be great. Number 2.
Really excited to go a little bit deeper into the conversation that we started last month. I know we were speaking initially just sort of about how the cortisol awakening response became a pretty default tool for testing stress in our community. And I'd love to go a little bit deeper into, sort of what these tests reveal about health more specifically, and how we can sort of dial it in for our patients.
Yeah, this is definitely the meat of it. This part of the podcast, I think, is what's going to get people really excited, because on the last podcast, as a reminder for those maybe who listened last time, maybe you're just catching the second one. We're talking about the cortisol awakening response, or the CAR, and it occurs on wakening in the absence of any apparent stressful situation or imminent danger, as research likes to say. And I think that's really cool because, it's not a stress response that sets it off. It's the body's natural way to get you ready, push you into alertness, handle your blood sugar, handle your inflammation, get you going and ready for the day. And it's really hugely impacted by your health status, your sleep the night before, lifestyle things you've chosen, your stress perception for the day, or what's going on in your week or your life or your month, or your whole year for some people, right? And so this is why I really like to test the cortisol awakening response. And so some of the things I want to really touch on this podcast is for people to understand, like, energy levels, resiliency, mood, blood sugar management, autoimmune, recall. These are huge aspects of people's life that they're struggling with. They're coming in and saying, my blood sugar's a mess. It's all over the place. I can't recall things like I used to. I think I might be getting dementia, and that's scary. I have autoimmune. I have Hashimoto's. I have MS, I have Addison's, and it's worsening. My symptoms were under control and they're not under control anymore. And oh, by the way, my stress is a 10 out of 10. So can you help me? Can you figure it out? And this is where the CAR really comes in, because it gives us so much information. So let's first talk about resiliency. So there are these two authors, Martin and Marsh, and in 2006, they sort of proposed academic resiliency, 5 points to academic resiliency. Now, I know we're in medical, I know we're in health resiliency, but I really liked it because they were talking about if you take a test, and in one of the studies I was also reading, it was about swimmers. So swimmers, professional swimmers who are going to do a swim competition, and how they handled resiliency. So first is confidence, second, coordination or planning, third is control, fourth is composure, like how anxious are you? And fifth is commitment, which is your persistence. So if you take into account your confidence, your coordination, your control, your composure, your commitment, then they found the better those were, the more resilient you were. And so when I talk about this with patients, it's amazing how they can point out, like, I am not composed. I go from 0 to 10. I have massive mood swings. I get anxious, or I get angry, or I cry at the top of the hat. Other people are like, I don't have the commitment. I'm too tired. I hurt. I don't have the family support. I don't have the financial support. So people can pick out in here what is getting in the way of the resiliency. But if we take it one step further, they say that there are two sort of characteristics of resilience. One, that there's some significant level of adversity and pressure that's experienced, but two, the individual is still able to experience positive outcomes. So in the study, that I'm quoting, it's the same one as from before, it was a successful performance. So it's either, again, a successful swim meet, you won, you passed the test, what have you. And what I find when it comes to resilience is that everybody has adversity, right? Like, we all have adversity. Life is stressful, but it's how we handle it, how we prepare for it, how we plan for it, our mood about it, and, positive outcomes. Because if we routinely get positive outcomes, then we're going to feel better about it, and we're going to be able to overcome it. And what's great is that your resilience ability affects not only your physiological, like can you get out of bed in the morning? Do your joints hurt? Are you inflamed? Do you have headaches? How's your digestion? But it also affects your cognitive and your behavior. Because if you don't feel very resilient, you're probably going to be more depressed, less motivated, not as happy, and you're not going to contribute as much maybe as you would like to your life or your family or your significant other or your friends or what have you. And so it's really important that we have resiliency as humans. And then that tie it back, how does resiliency tie into this cortisol awakening response that we've been talking about over and over? And it turns out that research says a too low or too high cortisol awakening response 100% affects your resiliency. So if you test and you know what your CAR is, and we know how to address it, then imagine all those resilience points that we talked about getting better. And now your mood's better. And now your inflammation's better. Now your energy's better. And now the way you interact with the world is better. And your production is better. All these things are so much better. And we just have to look at this marker, this cortisol awakening response. And what I find super cool is the ability of resilience, just as an example. And this is, I'll give you this example of me because I'm super proud of my little resilient body in this example. But I did the 5-day fasting mimicking diet, and I took CAR tests the day before, all 5 days, and then 2 days after. So I did a lot of saliva tubes, that's for sure.
That's a lot of spitting and a lot of tubes.
It's a lot of collection, but I did it in the name of science, so I can talk about it. So my personal cortisol awakening response the day before testing was pretty good. I go up within 30 minutes like normal, and then I go down, down, down through the rest of the day. And that's about how I feel. I don't drink coffee. I do like green tea, but more for the health benefits, less for the caffeine. And I'm more of a morning person. It's my husband and friends tend to describe me that way. Now, when I got into the fasting mimicking diet on day 2, my cortisol awakening response shot up and stayed up. It's like my body was going, what are you doing? What is this? You normally eat. Why are you not eating? Like, we have to shift everything to deal with the fact that you've made changes, right? A stressor happened in my body, even though the fasting mimicking diet has a lot of beneficial things. I'm still really restricting my calories, and it was different than my norm. And so my body reacted by raising my cortisol to address the fact that I was lower energy, I was lower calorie, therefore I was lower glucose. But the really super cool thing is 2 days after stopping the fasting mimicking diet, within 2 days, I bounced back. Within 2 days, my cortisol awakening response was almost basically back to normal. And I felt pretty good. I felt back to normal. And that's normal. That's a normal, healthy response. When people do something out of the ordinary or something happens to them, they should be able to adjust and then get back to homeostasis. Their CAR and their cortisol release should, address whatever's happening and then go back. And the way I describe it to people is like a trampoline. When you are going through life bouncing on your trampoline, you should be able to bounce down and go back up over and over and over again. But what happens is people don't take care of themselves, and they just keep putting more and more and more on their trampoline. And now when they bounce, it's become threadbare, or maybe there's holes. So you bounce and you don't have the snap back up like you used to, or you bounce and you actually, your foot falls through. And so now you hit the ground, and then that's how people feel. That's what they say when they come in to see you. They're like, yeah, I don't have the bounce like I used to. I don't know what's going on. Like, you've got to help fix me. And we can see it in the CAR, in the cortisol awakening response. But what's even cooler than that is that it's completely malleable. It's completely changeable. And I think I want people to know that when they run these biomarkers, when they run these tests, that it's not set in stone. So there was another study where they took 38 subjects, and I would have loved to be on this study. So 38 subjects, for 3 months, they sent them to a meditation and yoga retreat center. They did an all vegetarian diet, and they did no regular work for 3 months. For 3 months, no regular work. I mean, that would stress me out to know what work I was coming back to. But for 3 months, yoga, meditation, and what they said was the increased CAR we report is likely related to increases in morning wakefulness and stress resilience. These results are consistent with others who have reported increases in the CAR after mindfulness-based practices. It is also possible that this intervention improved sleep quality, and this in turn impacted a more dynamic and robust CAR. So it just goes to show, now I know not everyone, I certainly can't go to a 3-month all-inclusive, no work, yoga and meditation retreat.
Yeah,
But
where does one sign up for one of those scientific studies?
right, exactly, right. Like I've got the slides, so we'll write the authors and see how we get involved in that. But just using consistent mindfulness-based practice, and better sleep, their CAR became more dynamic, more robust, and they said they had increased stress resiliency. And so the takeaway, my personal takeaway from that is that, one, obviously what we've been preaching, your CAR is a good indicator of stress resiliency, but your CAR is malleable and it is responsive to inside and outside forces. My second takeaway is that people who downplay mindful-based practices are wrong, because regular mindfulness-based practices, meditating, journaling, taking care of yourself, self-care, grounding, that kind of things, it's good coupled with good sleep. It does wonders for your cortisol awakening response. It's like an adaptogen. It's like an adaptogenic herb for your cortisol awakening response. So don't brush it aside. Don't downplay it. Those of you who are listening to this going, I don't have very good resiliency. You can change it, which is so fantastic. But what I want to move into next is, what else does the CAR affect? The big one is recall. So many people worried about Alzheimer's dementia with good reason, and they're struggling for recall when trying to remember things the day before. And the CAR is controlled by the hippocampus. So any kind of hippocampal damage or atrophy will affect your cortisol awakening response. And that normal rise in cortisol helps to improve your recall for the next day. So if you are under a lot of stress, you've got a flatlined curve, you got a flatline CAR, and the next day you're like, what did I read? What did he say? What was that thing I was trying to remember? What did I need at the store that I said yesterday? It gets tied hand in hand. If you can get your CAR up and your stress under control, then your memory greatly improves. However, as many people know, cortisol can be quite damaging to the hippocampus, which again, memory. So if you have too high of a cortisol awakening response, you wake up hypervigilant, you wake up anxious, you wake up, 0 to 10, that can actually be problematic for the hippocampus. So it's like Goldilocks, like anything. It's like not too much, not too little, and then you will have the perfect recall. So if those listening are having problems with recall, let's test your CAR and let's try to help you out. What about inflammation? I get asked this a lot. Carrie, I wake up in pain. I wake up, my joints hurt. I wake up stiff. Could that have to do with cortisol? Absolutely. There's a quote here by a journal, in the Journal of Psychiatry and Psychiatric Disorders in 2018. And they said chronic circadian misalignment, so if your circadian rhythm's all messed up, significantly reduces cortisol levels and increase the release of inflammatory factors, including tumor necrosis factor, interleukin, and C-reactive protein. So those of you with chronic circadian misalignment and low cortisol levels, you're going to have higher inflammatory factors. You're probably going to be the people who wake up in pain, joint pain, inflamed, puffy, those sort of things, because that misalignment in your cortisol is being affected. And as we know, cortisol is anti-inflammatory to a point, and we need that inflammation, or excuse, not the inflammation, that cortisol to drive the inflammation up to a normal level. Now, we also know if you have too much inflammation, obviously it's a problem. But what happens is it's a feedback mechanism. So people will say, well, I don't understand how this works. So it's a feedback mechanism. So cortisol goes up, and then it shuts down the loop for further inflammatory cytokine production. And if you don't get that healthy rise in cortisol, you don't get that feedback loop. So the body just keeps making more inflammatory cytokines, and that's why you hurt. That's why your inflammation keeps going and you can't heal. So it's really important that we focus on that CAR. And then if we talk about inflammation, we have to talk about autoimmune, because this is the big one. This was the huge aha moment for me that I had a couple years ago. I was at a autoimmune conference, and a PhD in immunology, Dr. Heather Zwicky, said, well, don't you know the cortisol awakening response is what helps kill the autoimmune cells made in the thymus gland? And I was like, what? Are you serious? So what happens is, for people who don't know what I'm talking about, your thymus gland, so not your thyroid, but thymus gland, makes immune cells, and the T cells in your thymus gland go through a process where they go from immature, then they differentiate, and then they keep going through this like kind of like a factory through these different steps. And at one of the very last steps, the body goes, okay, little T cell, I can't release you. And if you're autoimmune, if you are accidentally created to be autoimmune, then I have to kill you. So what the thymus gland does is it runs it through something called central tolerance, which is where it takes the T cell and it runs it basically through every tissue in your body. It's a very smart thymus gland, and it runs it through every cell in your or tissue in your body. And if you pop positive, which means you fail central tolerance, in my head, the analogy is you get pulled to the side and you're going to be killed, because you can't have a T cell that's reactive to yourself. That's a fail. But in order to kill it, you have to have the cortisol awakening response. What stimulates the apoptosis, or the killing of those cells that fail central tolerance, is your CAR. Now, if you don't have a CAR, if you don't get the cortisol awakening response, then those sneaky little bastards, those T cells that are reactive to things like your thyroid or your adrenal glands or, whatever, your brain, your joints, they sneak out into circulation, and they can increase your risk for autoimmune or increase your symptoms if you already have that autoimmune.
Yeah, this is super fascinating. I'm glad you brought this up, because ultimately the sort of journey from health to autoimmune disease is something that I think functional medicine has a much better grasp on than conventional medicine. But, yep. Typically it's talked of in terms of environmental factors like toxins or leaky gut kind of stuff. So how new is this research into this part of the mechanism? And, for all of the doctors that I know that have maybe come to functional medicine because of something like Hashimoto's, right? I think we all know quite a few doctors who have arrived here from reversing their own autoimmunity. Right. This seems like this might be an early indicator that you're heading in this direction, and we can catch it earlier.
Yep, I would agree, and I think because. Well, the biochemistry's been there forever, right? The biochemistry is what it is. Like the cortisol awakening response is what helps trigger the killing of those cells in the thymus gland. So people learned it in physiology. They learned it going through an anatomy class and what have you, but it hasn't gotten highlighted until very recently. It wasn't, so I think people are like, okay, yeah, that's how cells can fail central tolerance. But they look to the outside, just like you said. They look at leaky gut, they're looking at environmental toxins, they're looking at genetic risk, they're looking at, whatever. And they're not, they didn't go back and look at when you have autoimmune just right there in your thymus gland. And so by highlighting the fact that, these cells will get killed if you have a normal CAR, let's focus on that. Let's get your cortisol awakening response up in the morning. Now, having said that, is there a lot of good, are there billions of dollars to be made for increasing the cortisol awakening response? No, but there are billions of dollars to be made in treating, like MS, right? Or Addison's disease, or some of these other rheumatoid arthritis. That's where the money goes. And so the CAR kind of fell to the wayside. And so that's why I'm so excited that it's found its shining moment again, because if you have a low CAR and you have autoimmune, or you have a strong family history of autoimmune, or you have all the risk factors for autoimmune, you want to address that CAR. You might as well address what you can address from the inside, right? Because that's usually relatively easy. We can work on getting the CAR up.
And even though it could be sort of classified as an environmental issue, ultimately a lot of the CAR is being response to like thought patterns and other things that, things that aren't related to your environment.
Right. Exactly. Oh, and yeah, choices. You choose to stay up late, you choose to be on your phone, therefore you have terrible sleep, and now you have car issues. And you do it night after night after night, then you're going to have problems. Your trampoline is going to wear thinner and thinner and thinner. And then you're going to show up at a functional medicine practitioner's office because nobody knows how to address, as you've moved through this progression of a threadbare trampoline, when we can address all these things. We can test for it, for one, and get a really good picture, and then address it. So which is why I love it. This is, for those looking at the slides, when I was talking earlier about the breast cancer, this is one of the research studies. This is from 2000 in the Journal of National Cancer Institute, where they said patients with metastatic breast cancer whose diurnal cortisol rhythms were flattened or abnormal had earlier mortality. So breast and actually prostate. I don't have the prostate studies listed, but prostate is in there as well. So those with breast and prostate cancer, they're actively working with breast and prostate cancer. I'm like, test your car. You have to test your car. If you don't, research says you have earlier mortality, and we can't have that. And the car is modifiable. So let's modify it and help improve outcomes. So to sort of sum up, testing the cortisol awakening response really gives you valuable health insight related to both resiliency, but longevity, right? Autoimmune longevity, cancer longevity, all these longevity things that are so important. So that's why I think this podcast is sort of the meat of it, where people can really relate to those symptoms. People really are like, that's what I went to my doctor for. That's what I went to my practitioner for. And for the practitioners listening, they're going to look at this like, oh my gosh, I can do so much with that. That gives me so much insight onto so many things by one easy test. And it's modifiable. So let's work on it.
Yeah, super interesting. Well, look, thank you so much for coming to share about it. And I really think that there's some pieces in here that may be new to a lot of practitioners, and ultimately, we're in the process of shifting from a disease-centric system to a health-centric system. And what I'm super excited about is just seeing, how very easy to quantify and easy to collect markers, in a certain way could be ahead of, could help us get ahead of the curve and not have us slip into some of these, really costly chronic illnesses. And ultimately, I'm excited also for the third in our series that's going to be coming up next month, where we're going to go deeper into like really chronic patients, because that's typically, who are coming into a lot of the clinics that we work with. And so I appreciate today. And I think we covered some ground that will be new and innovative to a lot of practitioners listening. So thank you so much for being part of it. Dr. Carrie Jones is the Chief Medical Officer for DUTCH Test. Check out DUTCHTest.com. They've got some great support for practitioners who want to start implementing the DUTCH Test. And we'll see you next month. We'll go into more about super chronic patients, and we'll see you then.